The rain hadn't stopped in 6 days, not once. It didn't drizzle or dance or whisper against rooftops. It pounded, steady and heavy, like fists on a locked door. By day 3, the county was a maze of drowned roads. By day 4, power grids failed. On the 5th, they stopped trying to name the neighborhoods being swallowed. They simply called the region a catastrophic zone. And by day 6, all that remained at the edge of Rosewater Creek was a broken mailbox, a rusting porch, and a golden retriever chained to what was left of a front step. The house behind him had already half collapsed, its roof sheared open, its insides gutted by water. The back wall had caved, exposing the hollow skeleton of a kitchen now filled with river mud. Mold grew over what had once been a family photo. Cupboards floated, furniture rotted in silence. And yet, the dog remained. He stood soaked to the chest in brackish floodwater, tethered to a bolt anchored into the porch. The chain was short, just long enough to allow him to lie down, if he wanted to. But he didn't. He stood, unmoving, unflinching. His fur clung to his ribs, golden coat stained black with oil and sewage. His eyes, glazed yet unwavering, stayed locked on the shattered front door as if still expecting it to open. It never did, because 3 nights ago someone had locked it from the outside and walked away. 30 miles inland, in the gymnasium-turned shelter, June was still pretending to be invisible. She hadn't spoken since she arrived, not when they gave her soup, not when they offered cots, not when a counselor asked if she had anywhere else to go. The clipboard they gave her was still blank. No contacts, no relatives, no history. Just her name written in jagged block letters. The truth was, she hadn't planned on surviving the flood. She had come back to Rosewater only to say goodbye, to stand outside the old trailer where her brother used to live. The one place still holding the scent of a life before everything fractured. She had told herself she wouldn't stay long, but the water came faster than anyone expected, and she didn't drown. Not physically, but parts of her did. The parts she'd been trying to bury since the overdose, since the foster system, since the day she stopped believing in rescue. Now, she sat hunched in the corner of the gym, pressed against a concrete wall still beaded with condensation. A single photograph folded into the lining of her boot was the only thing she had managed to save. Her brother, 17 years old, smiling beside a beat-up motorcycle. Before the pills, before he sold her bike for a fix, before he stopped calling her sis. The speaker system crackled to life with garbled evacuation updates, but no one listened. They were too tired, too soaked with grief. That's when she heard it, not from the speakers, but from the group of volunteers whispering near the aid tables. "The dog's still out there. Same place, tied to a porch off Hollow Bend. They say he hasn't moved. 3 days, just standing in the flood. Still alive. Can you believe it?" Some were horrified. Others were fascinated. To June, it hit like a brick to the chest, because she knew that kind of waiting. She had waited once too, for someone to come back, for the door to open, for a voice to say, "I didn't mean to leave." But it never came, and somehow that damn dog was still waiting, with the kind of loyalty that breaks you to look at. She left the shelter without a word. No one stopped her. She didn't have a plan. Just an old military surplus poncho she grabbed from a crate, a flashlight that barely worked, and a pair of boots with a cracked sole. She walked past rows of emergency tents, past people calling out names that never answered back, past the yellow barricades that warned, "Do not cross." She crossed. The road to Hollow Bend had become a corridor of dying trees and debris. Cars sat submerged like metal corpses. A swing set peeked from the current, like fingers reaching up from a grave. But June walked on. The rain stung her eyes. Her hands burned from gripping a branch to balance herself across a collapsed bridge. Her foot slipped once, plunging her leg thigh-deep in freezing water. But she pulled herself out with a grunt and kept going. Not because she wanted to be a hero, but because something in her recognized something in him, a desperate kind of stillness, the kind that waits for mercy, even when it knows better. And then she saw him. The porch barely stood now, more driftwood than structure. The dog's chain was taut, pulled to the last link. The water reached his knees now. He should have been barking, panicking, straining. But he wasn't. He was still, not lifeless, intentional, like he'd committed to that spot, like he had promised himself he wouldn't move until the person who tied him there returned. June dropped to her knees in the shallow water. She didn't care about the smell, the filth, the cold that bit deep into her bones. "You dumb thing," she said hoarsely. "You waited anyway, didn't you?" He looked at her, not with fear, not with relief, but with quiet, dangerous faith, the kind that says, "I will love you even if it kills me." And June, for the first time in years, felt something sharp break open in her chest. Not grief, not anger, but recognition. Because maybe the only thing more painful than being abandoned was refusing to stop believing someone would come back. June's boots slipped twice on the algae-slick wood as she stepped onto what remained of the porch. Every movement sent small waves across the rising water. The boards groaned under her weight, threatening to collapse entirely. But she didn't stop. Her eyes locked on the golden retriever ahead, still unmoving, still chained to the base of a half-rotted beam. She spoke softly. "Hey, boy, I'm here now." Her voice cracked from disuse, but the words floated over the rain like a fragile rope. The dog blinked slowly. He didn't growl, didn't back away, but he didn't step toward her either. His body was stiff, spine straight, head level with hers. It was a stance of waiting, not trust. June crouched, the water now past her shins. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you. I'm not like him." She didn't know if she meant his owner or her brother or someone else entirely. The retriever flicked his ears but didn't move. June reached slowly into her jacket pocket and pulled out the only thing she'd grabbed before leaving the shelter, a protein bar, half smashed, still in its wrapper. She unwrapped it with shaky hands and held it out. "Look, not much, but I figured maybe you'd be hungry." He sniffed the air, nostrils twitching. Still, he stayed frozen. June took a step closer, then another. The water was chest deep now. She could feel the pull of the current against her calves. She was running out of time, and she knew it. She reached the post where the chain was fastened. Rust had eaten half of the metal clasp. The other half was buried deep in the wood. She pulled once. Nothing. Again. Nothing. It had been screwed in too tight, maybe years ago. She reached behind her back, pulling a broken screwdriver from her waistband, salvaged from her old trailer toolbox, long before the flood. The tip was bent, but the handle held. She jammed it into the gap between the bolt and the post and twisted. "Come on, don't do this now." The screwdriver slipped. June's hand tore open on the edge of the bolt, a red gash blooming down her palm. She hissed, but didn't let go. "I know what it's like," she muttered, half to him, half to herself, "to be tied to something that's already sinking, to keep waiting even after they've left you behind. But you don't have to keep standing here. I swear, you don't." Behind her, the wind howled louder. The rain thickened into sheets. The water licked at the retriever's belly now. Still, he stood frozen, not in fear, but in ritual. Like he'd memorized this pain, like it was the only thing still holding the shape of his life together. June pressed her head to the wet post. Then, through gritted teeth, she whispered, "I stayed too. I stayed way past the point I should have. For people who never looked back, for someone who only saw me when they needed something, for promises that rotted faster than the trailer walls I grew up in." She slammed the screwdriver again. The wood cracked. She twisted harder, using both hands, ignoring the blood. And suddenly, with a pop like a bone breaking, the bolt gave. The chain went slack. But the dog didn't move. He just looked at her, eyes wide, hollow, trembling not from the cold, but from confusion. He was free. But his body didn't believe it yet. June dropped the tool and stepped closer, slipping the chain off his neck. Her fingers brushed the raw skin where metal had rubbed bone. He flinched, but he didn't run. He didn't need a leash. He just needed a reason. June placed her hand gently on his soaked fur. "Let's go," she said. "You don't have to wait for ghosts." For a second, nothing happened, and then, like something inside him finally surrendered, he stepped forward, just once. Then again, he followed her off the porch. They were waist-deep in the current now. June clutched a tree limb with one hand, guiding them back toward the higher ground. The retriever stayed by her side, stumbling a little with exhaustion, but he didn't stop. The river tried to pull them under, but he stayed. She slipped once, fell hard, and he circled her, whining, nudging her arm until she got up again. They moved together, not as rescuer and rescued, but as survivors bound by something deeper than circumstance. By the time they reached the edge of the flood zone, June's legs were numb. Her palms were raw. The rain hadn't let up. But she turned to the dog beside her, soaked and trembling, and whispered, "You waited for someone who wasn't coming. Now I'll wait with you, as long as it takes." By the time June stumbled back into the evacuation zone, soaked to the bone and leading the golden retriever by nothing but a frayed rope she'd found tangled in driftwood, people stared like they were seeing a ghost. No one said anything at first. Then the whispers started. "She went out there alone? That's the dog from Hollow Bend. How the hell is he still alive?" A man from the fire department ran toward her, shouting orders, but stopped when he saw the blood streaked down her arms. One of the volunteers stepped forward with a blanket, but June waved it off. The dog, still silent, still close, leaned into her side like an anchor. A woman from animal control knelt nearby. She looked tired, professional, already mentally filling out forms in her head. "We'll take it from here," she said softly. "We have a shelter set up." June flinched. "No, you won't." The woman blinked. "Ma'am, this dog has been through trauma. We have teams. He just spent a week waiting for someone who left him chained to drown. He doesn't need another place that says they'll figure it out later." The silence thickened. The golden retriever pressed closer to June's leg. "He stays with me," she said, her voice low and sharp. "Or I walk back into that river with him." And something about the way she said it, not dramatic, not desperate, just final, made everyone back off. The woman from animal control nodded once, almost out of respect. "All right," she said. "Then we'll need a name for the file." June paused. She looked down at the dog. His golden coat was now streaked with black water and flecks of red. His eyes, though tired, held a quiet fire, the kind that refuses to be extinguished just because it's been ignored. She whispered, "River." It wasn't easy after that. Word spread fast. People in town suddenly had opinions. Some called her a hero. Some said she'd been reckless. Others whispered darker things about her past, about the trailer she used to live in, about the brother who OD'd in the garage, and the girl who never looked anyone in the eye. But June didn't answer to them. She didn't owe them her history. She only owed River her presence. And every day, she showed up. She slept beside him at the edge of the shelter's courtyard, refusing a cot inside. She fed him from her own tray. When someone offered to buy her a leash, she declined. "He walks where I walk," she said. "That's enough." A week later, a local journalist showed up. They'd heard the story secondhand, wanted to capture a feel-good moment in the midst of so much devastation. But when the reporter asked June for an interview, she said no. "Why not?" they asked. "You saved him. People want to hear it." She stared at them, dry-eyed, unsmiling. "No one saved him. He was saving himself the whole time. All I did was show up." But the photo they snapped, of June sitting cross-legged in the grass, River's head resting on her lap, both of them watching the rain with the same unblinking stillness. That photo went everywhere. It wasn't glossy or polished. It was raw. It was true. And something about it broke people open. They started sending letters, not just from nearby counties, but from other states. Stories from children who had also waited in silence, from veterans who understood the loyalty of an animal better than their own family, from women who had been left behind and had stayed too long. They called him the dog who waited, but some called him something else. Proof. Proof that you can be broken and still be whole, that you can wait too long and still be worth rescuing, that someone might still come, even when they're not supposed to. And June, she didn't smile for cameras, she didn't take donations, but when a little girl ran up one morning and asked, "Is River your dog now?" she knelt down beside her and said, "No, he's mine, and I'm his. We chose each other." Weeks passed, the floodwaters receded, but not everything went back to normal. Because normal had never meant safety, only silence. Entire neighborhoods were gone. Schools turned into shelters. Families slept in gymnasiums, trying to stitch together lives from the wreckage. And June, she stayed in the same spot, at the edge of the courtyard beneath the skeleton of an old basketball hoop, with River curled beside her feet like a living memory. She refused all offers of housing, turned down clothing drives, food cards, and helpful people who tried to guide her toward programs she didn't ask for. They said she was difficult. They were half right. She wasn't difficult, just done being managed. River had changed since the rescue. He no longer flinched when someone raised a hand. He no longer stared at every doorway like someone might walk through it with a leash or an apology. But he didn't seek affection either. He sat in stillness, and people started noticing. One afternoon, a boy wandered out of the shelter. 9, maybe 10, shoes 2 sizes too big, a hoodie that swallowed his frame. He sat down 5 feet from River and just stared. June noticed, said nothing. River glanced at the boy, and then, slowly, crawled closer, inches at a time, until his nose brushed the boy's knee. The boy didn't pet him. He didn't cry. He just leaned forward, forehead against River's head, and stayed there. The next day, the boy came back, this time with 2 crackers, the next with his little sister. By the end of the week, 3 more kids had joined. They didn't talk, but they sat, and River let them. That's when the therapist arrived, sent by the county, clipboard in hand, assigned to assess displaced minors. She watched the scene from a distance, taking notes. At first she thought it was a fluke, a one-off moment of animal comfort. Then she asked June, "Has he been trained?" June looked at her, brow raised. "No, but he remembers what it's like to be locked in place. That's the kind of training you don't need a whistle for." The therapist didn't understand, not really, but she kept watching. And then she started bringing others. A teenage girl who hadn't spoken since her mother disappeared in the storm. A boy who'd tried to run from the shelter 3 times in a single week. A child who refused to eat unless seated on the floor, away from adults. One by one, they were introduced to River, and one by one, he showed them what no form of therapy could offer: presence without pressure, attention without judgment, love without a timeline. People started coming to see him on purpose, not like a celebrity, but like a ritual. They came to sit with River when the noise in their heads got too loud, when they needed someone to remind them that being still was okay, that being hurt didn't mean being abandoned forever. River never barked, never performed. He didn't fetch or roll over. He simply stayed. And in a world where most people only stay when it's easy, that became sacred. Someone from the city wrote an article. Then someone else created a short video. In less than a month, River's story spread online. Not the polished version, not the headline about survival, but the part that mattered. The image of him sitting in a rain puddle, surrounded by children who had lost everything, teaching them that stillness could be safe. And then the offers came flooding in. Shelters asked if River could visit. Animal groups offered funding for outreach programs. Therapists wrote to June, asking how he'd been trained to support trauma patients. She never replied. Instead, she walked to the far edge of the field behind the shelter, where flood debris had piled high: wood, wire, rusted tools, plastic chairs. She dragged a broken door from the wreckage, propped it upright, and nailed a single word into the center: stayed. The message was clear. River wasn't a service dog. He wasn't a case study. He was a survivor. who had simply chosen not to run and whose stillness had saved more than his own life. No one called it a program. There were no schedules, no counselors with badges, no clipboards full of progress charts. Just a field, a bench made from storm debris, and a dog who had waited too long to believe anyone would ever come, and yet still stayed. That was enough to begin with. River didn't do tricks. He didn't sit on command or roll over. What he offered wasn't obedience, it was presence. And presence, it turned out, was the one thing these children had never really had. Not consistently, not quietly, not without strings. June never called herself anything. Not a rescuer, not a founder. She didn't build a nonprofit. She built a space. With her hands were charfons, with her scars, with the same slow resolve that had once pulled a chain from a rotting porch post. She collected pieces of broken things, planks, rusted nails, warped chairs, and shaped them into something almost sacred, a circle of silence. There was no ceremony, there was no speech, just the door, still upright in the center of the field, still bearing the single carved word, stayed. The children kept coming. Some came for the dog, even after he began to slow down, even after his muzzle grayed and he could no longer meet them halfway. Others came for what lingered around him, the sense that this was a place where nothing bad would be asked of them, a place where no one was trying to fix them, but no one would leave them alone either. And River? He gave what he could, for as long as he could. He didn't need to be held. He didn't ask for treats or praise. He just let them sit near him. Some days, that was enough. Other days, he would press his head gently into a child's shoulder like he knew their story, without needing to hear it out loud. Even the therapists stopped asking questions after a while. They brought their clipboards, then put them down. Some of them stayed longer than expected. One even cried once, quietly, behind the door, after watching a child speak for the first time in 6 months, not to a human, but to River. By the end of that first year, River could barely stand on cold mornings. June started carrying a blanket in her bag to keep his hips warm. Still, he insisted on being outside. Still, he wanted to watch the sky. Still, he listened. And when the day came that he couldn't rise, when his breath slowed and his body gave in, June didn't call anyone. She just sat beside him in the grass while the dew clung to her jeans and the wind moved through the trees like a lullaby. No one remembered writing. She didn't cry, not because it didn't hurt, but because the grief wasn't sudden. It had lived inside her for months, curling next to River's aging body, arriving slowly, giving her time to build a place for it. She buried him by the oak, not far from where they first stopped to rest. She didn't build a headstone, just laid a smooth, flat river stone on the soil and wrote a single word in black paint. Enough. But the children still came. Even those who had never met River in the flesh came to sit where he had once waited. They told stories they hadn't told to anyone else. They laid feathers, flowers, buttons at the base of the tree. They ran their hands along the word carved in the old door. And June stayed. Some mornings she would sit with her hands in her lap, her eyes on the clouds, and listen to the quiet. Other days she'd read aloud. Not lessons, just pages of poetry, or letters people had written to the dog who never answered but always heard. One afternoon, a little girl with tangled curls asked, "Will there be another dog?" June looked at her for a long moment and said, "No, he wasn't a pet. He was a place." That was the story, really. A place made of fur and breath and silence. A place that waited even when no one said thank you. A place that didn't move on, but grew roots. River was never replaced, because legends don't get replaced. They get remembered, stone by stone, breath by breath, in the way we learn to stay for others after someone once stayed for us. And if you're reading this now, wondering what any of it means, maybe it's just this. Not every miracle is loud. Not every savior walks on 2 legs. And sometimes the greatest thing we can do is not to leave, but to stay. If River's story touched something in you, stay a little longer and share it with someone who once waited too.